Oregon has long been known for its abundant natural resources. Since the first settlers came to Oregon, they began to exploit these resources. With an abundance of trees that could be harvested for lumber, as well as highly productive river systems, fisheries and logging became the predominant resources harvested. Nowhere in the state was this more prevalent than in Coos County. Fish and trees in the late 1800s seemed to be limitless. In 1887, they devised a system to finally exploit the timber from the headwaters of the Coos Bay watershed. The method they used is called a splash dam, a dam made of log stringers strategically placed in the river where thousands of logs could be placed in the dam's nearly dry reservoir over the course of the summer. Fall rains caused the rivers to swell and the reservoirs to fill. The logs floated in the reservoir and were poised to be ushered downstream. The timber companies did not know what they were doing, but this practice decimated the essential spawning habitat in the Coos watershed. Nearly all of the spawning habitat was destroyed, leaving only vast expanses of bedrock. The Coos River Chinook was believed to have been reduced to only a handful of fish. Today, things have changed. In the summer of 1980, the director of the Department of Fish and Wildlife, Jack Donaldson, announced to the state that the agency was going to adopt a public involvement program called the Salmon and Trout Enhancement Program, STEP. 2 years after the STEP program began, volunteers began the arduous task of restoring the Coos River fall Chinook population. The first undertaking was to try to collect, hold, and spawn the remnants of the fall Chinook runs in the Coos River. The best technique for holding the Chinook was nothing more than sandbags that created a pool in a ditch in a farmer's field. A total of 11 pairs of Chinook were spawned from this rudimentary holding pond. These were the first native Chinook to be spawned in the Coos in almost half a century. In 1983, volunteers began construction of a raceway that would double as both a holding pond for spawning and rearing pond for their offspring. This raceway was a colossal endeavor for a fledgling STEP group. Hundreds of hours from devoted volunteers were expended in the summer of 1983 to complete this project. Incubation facilities were also constructed. In 1984, volunteers began to aggressively address the limitation of spawning habitat available to the fall Chinook. Hundreds of structures were placed into the watershed to enhance spawning habitat. In a single day, 180 volunteers hand-loaded 420 tons of rock into wire baskets intended to mimic the old-growth trees that trapped spawning gravel prior to removal by the splash dams. The Gabions transformed stream reaches to restore spawning habitat where it had been absent for over 100 years. In 1986, the Morgan Creek fish facilities were expanded to accommodate the successful return of salmon to the facility. Morgan Creek only had about a dozen Chinook in at the beginning of our efforts, and the returns became very promising. Holding and rearing ponds as well as trapping facilities were constructed. Volunteers and community donations made this a successful hatchery. The fishery had already begun to expand, and there were substantial educational opportunities available to student groups. Today, the Morgan Creek Step Hatchery is a state-of-the-art facility. Because of an overwhelming amount of support from local companies as well as community members, Morgan Creek is now a $1.7 million resource. The new facility has a large raceway that doubles as an adult holding pond and juvenile rearing pond. The initial rains of the fall facilitate the salmon to ascend Morgan Creek and return to the facility where they began their lives. Once in the facility, students and volunteers sort the salmon to determine which ones are ready to be spawned. Eggs and sperm are taken from the fish by the army of adults and youth. In addition to spawning the returning hatchery fish, naturally produced Chinook from 7 traps and netting operations are also spawned at the Morgan Creek Hatchery. This also increases genetic variability and success. Over 3,000 salmon contribute to the gene pool at Morgan Creek each season. This number of parents is critical to mimicking wild populations of Chinook. The eggs and sperm are then transferred to Bandon Hatchery, where the eggs are fertilized and placed into incubation trays. There, the eggs remain for approximately 1 month until the eggs become resilient. It's at this stage that the eggs are distributed to multiple programs. Bandon Hatchery retains over 500,000 eggs to raise at their facility. Other eggs go to hatch boxes, other step facilities, and another department hatchery. In the spring of the year, 250,000 Chinook are netted out of the ponds at Bandon Hatchery, run through a fish pump and a sorter, loaded onto a truck, and taken back to Morgan Creek. Also in the spring of the year, the tiny salmon are fed by volunteers. Once the fish are at the fingerling stage, about 3 inches long, they are ready to be fin marked. Hundreds of students and volunteers return to the facility to participate in the fin marking operation. Fin marking is necessary to be able to recognize and monitor the fish released from Morgan Creek. It is important to document the movement of juvenile Chinook through Coos Bay, as well as the contribution to various ocean and inland fisheries. Marking is also a necessity to evaluate the percentage of fish that stray and don't return to Morgan Creek.
I think it's great that we get all of our school kids. They get numerous times through their elementary education, and then again in high school they get to come out and have hands-on natural resource education. And so dealing with the fin clipping or in the fall with the spawning of the adults, it's pretty fun to actually get in, roll your sleeves up and get wet. So.
From these tagging operations, we know that Coos Chinook contribute well to fisheries all the way to the Aleutians in Alaska. Once the Chinook are marked, they are released in the spring of the year to complete their rearing in the Coos Bay estuary prior to entering the ocean as smolts in the fall of the year. Since the first releases of fingerling Chinook, the size of the fish are monitored at ocean entrance to ensure that the carrying capacity of Coos Bay has not been exceeded. Large seine nets are hauled onto the beach at several locations, and the size and weight of both the wild and hatchery Chinook are monitored. Based on these surveys, the hatchery program in the basin has not impacted the growth and abundance of wild Chinook. The salmon trap on the South Fork Coos River that was originally constructed in 1900 was reconstructed and now is an important broodstock collection tool. The Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife conducted a multi-year study to determine the number of hatchery fish spawn with the wild Chinook in the watershed. The study documented that over a 4-year period, only about 8% of the spawning population in the basin was composed of stray hatchery fish. This is a very low rate of strays and is not a source of concern to fish biologists. When the program first began at Morgan Creek, the annual harvest of fall Chinook in the Coos watershed was only about 200 fish per year. That number has since been increased to nearly 11,000 fish in 2011. The Chinook fishery in Coos Bay is now known as a renowned fishery. This fishery attracts anglers from all over the United States. The healthy fishery now has a profound impact on the economy of the local community and Oregon. In addition to the hatchery buildings on the property, a new classroom facility has been built for use by students and groups that participate in our program.
Okay, ladies, hold out your hands like that. Okay, but you have to hold them out. Now, can you guys scoot down just a little bit? Hold them out, and then what I'm going to do is go like this. You have to hold them out over. Okay? There you go.
This classroom has become an instrumental tool to impart resource ownership to the thousands of student participants.
Contribution of this is the education component. How many kids we have come into the hatchery, how many students, how many generations we've had of different students coming through the hatchery and learning about the salmon, as well as learning how this affects us in the watershed, in the community, and how everything that we do affects in one way or another the fish.
Student involvement is the lasting legacy of the Morgan Creek Hatchery. Currently, we have generations of community members that have volunteered at the facility. Often, parents and teachers bring their children to the facility when they themselves were there as children. The popularity of the Morgan Creek programs stem from the unique hands-on learning opportunities that are provided. The facility attracts student groups from all over Oregon and beyond. Students are now the cornerstone of the fish cultural programs at Morgan Creek. Some of the eggs are distributed to schools around Coos County. Nearly every elementary school student in Coos County receives a live Chinook egg to care for and, most importantly, name. This is a tremendous task. Each classroom is given an educational puppet that depicts the life cycle of a fall Chinook, and then they get to watch as their egg develops into a small fry. This Classroom Aquaria program is an effort to educate and involve the youngest members of our community into the salmon restoration efforts. The on-site production goal for Morgan Creek Hatchery is 1.1 million Chinook annually. Over 2 million Chinook are released annually from the Morgan Creek Hatchery complex. This is the largest hatchery production program outside of the Columbia River Basin. Since the inception of the hatchery program at Morgan Creek, the health of naturally produced Chinook in the basin have always been of paramount importance. The spawning habitat restoration work that began 30 years ago continues to this day. In the last 30 years, naturally produced Chinook numbers have increased to over 7,000 fish. The combined efforts of habitat restoration and the fish cultural operations at STEP program facilities in the Coos have increased the fall Chinook population in recent years to over 35,000 fish. This is a dramatic increase in a population of fish that a short time ago was considered to be nearly extinct. Morgan Creek Hatchery is solely supported by volunteers and donations. This invaluable educational and economic project has taken community partners 40 years to develop, and now it requires your volunteer time and financial gifts to perpetuate. The stewardship of these magnificent fish is inherited from our parents, but soon their care and upkeep will be handed over to our children.